Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me out there. Um, as I think many of you know, my name is Erin Hallett, and I'm head of alumni relations at the business school. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this afternoon to join our first ever virtual marketing professional interest network. And not just that, it's our first ever virtual professional interest network. As everyone's been going through this rather challenging last few months, we are working through ways to keep engaging our alumni and business school communities. And we truthfully have been overwhelmed by everyone's response, their patience during this time. And we're really grateful. And we have a great turnout today, not just from alumni, but from students, friends of the business school, friends of the college. So a big warm welcome to everybody. And I just want to, before I completely disappear from this event, I just wanted to also say to all of our alumni out there, we really thank you for all the support you've given us the last few months. There's been so much going on in the background, both at the business school and the college, as we work with our current students and bring new students in. And we know we've reached out a lot to you, and you've all responded so well and really supported us during this time. And I know our students are just as grateful. So thank you to everyone. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Lara Zaman, who's one of the committee chairs, and she's going to introduce our guest today, Will Tapp. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Laura. I'm an alumna of the Strategic Marketing Master's Program at Imperial College Business School, and I'm currently working as a planning manager at one of Publicis Group's media agency. Today, I'm very pleased to have Will Tapp as our speaker to the first online event of the PIN. So it has a very topical presentation, so I'm really happy he's agreed to take part in this. Will is from ITV. He has worked in advertising and marketing for 15 years, so a lot of experience under his belt. He started his career in account management, working on brands including Unilever, Mars, EasyJet, and Land Rover. After becoming a global business director, he's then moved on and changed his career to become to work in strategy. He's worked as a strategist at Google Arts and Culture, and then moved on to ITV. He's worked on some impressive campaigns that have been recognized and honored by the likes of IPA, Cannes, and the UK Marketing Society, just to name a few. Whilst doing all this, he's also been able to attain an MBA from London Business School. I will now hand over to Will for his presentation, but I also want to ask you all to submit your questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box, and then Will take as many as possible at the end of the session. Will, over to you.
Thank you, Laura. I'm just going to share my screen, so fingers crossed this will work. Let's see if that's working. Hopefully everybody can see this. And I just wanted to start by saying how flattered I was to be invited to do this presentation. I was an MBA student relatively recently, so it feels like quite a big deal to be presenting to everyone, to be on this side of the lectern. I'm going to start by explaining this initial slide. So when we put this presentation together, it was in the depths of April, and if you cast your mind back, that was very much the sort of height of the lockdown period. It really, was very difficult, both in terms of, the sort of response to the coronavirus, but also the business world at the time. And we wanted to put together a presentation that was a bit more optimistic, that took a more realistic view of what might happen once lockdown was lifted. And you'll see one of our slides talks about the coronavirus and lockdown being an event that would pass. And we wanted to sort of push back against some of the negativity that was surrounding the marketing world in particular, hence the unicorn and the narwhal. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, this initial slide, but it serves an important purpose. So before I come on to the main presentation itself, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about my role and the team I come from at ITV. So the client strategy and planning team is a relatively new team at ITV. We've been going for a year, and I'd say we really hit our stride last autumn. And we exist to build more strategic relationships with ITV's biggest advertisers. And the way that we do that is we provide lots of added value services that draw on the expertise and knowledge that exists more broadly at ITV. So that could be the programming teams, it could be the research teams, it could be the data teams that power things like the ITV Hub, which is our version of the iPlayer. And we have a different kind of KPI to most of the teams in the commercial department. So it's not about money, it's all about client satisfaction. So we can take a slightly more neutral, longer term view of the relationships we have with our advertisers. It's a really interesting team to work on. So it's the most diverse marketing strategy team that I have ever worked on. So we have specialists in creative strategy. We have some fantastic data scientists. We also have people from a sort of media agency background. So these are sort of communication strategists, TV planners, and then also a pretty strong research arm as well. So lots and lots of different thinkers. We can tackle lots of different problems, and it's a very, very exciting place to work. Lots of very, very smart people with lots of very challenging ideas. And our work falls into sort of four broad areas. Some of these are quite traditional. So, for example, audience insight and effectiveness are just the sorts of things that you would imagine ITV to do for their biggest clients. But we are also very interested in innovation, and that particularly is the way that TV and digital are interacting. And finally, we provide inspiration and insight to our clients as well, which is where this presentation came from. So, as I said, what we wanted to do at ITV was provide a sort of medium-term view of what is going to happen in the marketing world as lockdown lifts. Now, this presentation is not designed as a very, very long-term view into 2021. I think it's almost impossible to tell what might happen next year. But what we wanted to sort of really focus upon was the sort of next window in time after lockdown, and sort of think about the way that that would impact some of our biggest clients. And you'll see that we've developed 4 different scenarios, so it's quite a nuanced view, and the sort of marketing strategies that our clients could use to take advantage of some of these scenarios. So the lifting of lockdown, and I mean, I wanted to start with this quote, and some of you may have seen it before, which is, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks where decades happen. And that couldn't have been more true than March and April. Like, you really felt sort of history being made around you. And I mean, it's still true today, I believe. And what we were finding at ITV was that although sort of March and April really did panic all of our clients, I would say, from our biggest to our smallest, there was a real sense of people just trying to survive in the market. Actually, what had happened then, and is happening even more now, is there was a realization that lockdown would pass. You know, the coronavirus is an event that will finish, hopefully. And actually, people were starting to sort of adopt a planning mindset. So they were trying to think about what was going to happen next. And this presentation is a tool to help that planning process. And actually, what we found is when you spoke to ITV viewers and the nation at large, actually people were quite optimistic about what this next phase might look like. And we've adopted this metaphor of the rainbow to talk about the sort of lifting of lockdown. So we're on the cusp of this phase right now. You know, it's genuinely happening now. You know, measures are easing, and, you know, we are sort of moving forward into life after the worst of lockdown. And actually, there's a really interesting sort of shift from the sort of passive acceptance of being locked inside your house to today, which is much more about simple pleasures, little wins, you know, this move from being completely isolated to sort of joining society again. And that's what this presentation is all about. So I guess the big question is what is over the rainbow? And, you know, again, this is a theme that will run throughout this presentation, which is, you know, the only thing predictable about a life is its unpredictability. So another famous philosopher, so Remy from Ratatouille. So this presentation is designed as a tool to aid your thinking. You know, it is not a replacement for some of the fantastic work that's been done by the sort of management consultancy firms out there. Some of the financial intelligence firms are doing really, really interesting modeling in terms of what is going to happen this year and beyond. So sort of talk about V-shaped and L-shaped recoveries. Instead, this is much more about helping marketeers frame the way that their particular segments and markets may develop and giving them a tool to think about that. This is not meant to be a wholly accurate prediction, but much rather a tool for thinking. So what we did when we were putting this presentation together was look outside of the UK. So whenever someone tells me something that is totally unprecedented, maybe it's just my contrarian nature, but I start to look around and say, really, is that true? And actually what we found with COVID-19 is once you looked outside of Europe in particular and to places like Japan, Korea, and then the early events in China, there was actually quite a lot of evidence about how consumer demand would respond to the lifting of lockdown. And you'll see that we've built out 4 scenarios that are very, very much based upon what has happened in the Far East. So we have 4 scenarios that we're going to talk through. We have a bonus one at the end, but each one of these is applicable to a range of different categories and hopefully spark some food for thought, because we've included marketing strategies that will help clients that fall into these particular scenarios make the best of these situations. So I'm going to start with the first scenario, which we've called Got Milk. And as you'll see, this is a scenario where we have a relatively stable recovery after the outbreak ends, once lockdown lifts, preceded by a spike in demand caused by panic buying. So this is very, very relevant for large supermarket chains and grocers out there. So if you think back to the sort of days of March and April, we were seeing shelves being completely emptied of the essentials. So, you know, everything from fresh fruit, milk, vegetables, etc. And what's really interesting is if you are a client or a business that falls into this particular scenario, there are 3 things we think that marketing can help with. So win back lost customers, retain newly won customers, and create brand difference. So I'm going to go through each one of these in order. I'm going to go quite quickly because we've got a lot to cover, but hopefully all of this will be food for thought. So what we found actually, when you looked at March, there were record-breaking revenues. I mean, genuinely, every single supermarket that we work with at ITV has done very, very well. And we found that actually most of them have increased their advertising spend over lockdown. So sort of the opposite of what you might think. So they did very, very well in March. But actually, what we believe, and we've heard this to a certain extent, is those record revenues actually were hiding a very, very disrupted market where all of these supermarkets were winning and losing customers. Some of the customers they were losing will have shopped with them for, you know, up to a decade, maybe more. You know, people genuinely are normally quite loyal when it comes to their supermarket shop. So it's a really interesting problem, which is these supermarkets were doing very, very well, but actually they should be concerned about sort of customer churn. So a great way to win back lost customers is using service as a point of difference. So there are 2 great case studies which are very famous in the marketing world. So there's the Sainsbury's Try Something New Today campaign and also the O2 Priority Moments campaign, which both focus very, very purely on service And actually what it was great at doing was making sure customers were loyal, increasing customer lifetime value, but actually they had the really positive byproduct of also being very powerful campaigns at attracting new customers. So if you find you are losing customers, and there's an example here of Sainsbury's, focus on what you do well to help win them back again. Now, the flip side of that equation is how do you retain new customers? And here, behavioral economics points the way. So how do you turn nascent habits into long-term behaviors? And there's a very, very powerful status quo bias always in situations like this. Well, there are two things that you can do, which is remember that all choices are relative. So how can you reframe the category to your advantage? And there are things which are more important now and will be more important in the future than prior to lockdown. So, for example, are you the most convenient, the most local? Are you the cheapest? So we believe there's a recession coming, so value will be important. Are you the freshest? Are you the fastest, particularly in that sort of online delivery space? So reframing the category to the situation after lockdown might be a very powerful way to retain these new customers. And then, of course, make your choice easy. So remove the barriers to stay. So if you have got a lot of new online customers, maybe make online delivery free for 6 months. Transferring points. So one of the reasons that we know that customers are very loyal to Tesco is their club card scheme. Could you compensate people for lost points? It would be a very, very powerful pull, a great way to get people to stay. And then finally, brand definition is going to be important. So we work with a company called System One, who are sort of company that measure creative effectiveness. And what they found was that during the early phases of lockdown, so that phase that people called the new normal, supermarkets advertising really cut through. It was very, very powerful because supermarkets were talking about themselves as an essential service. So if you remember back, the supermarkets were talking about how they were working very, very hard to keep the shelves stacked. You know, their staff were essential workers essentially. So it's a really interesting space for them to play in. However, you can't do that forever, you know, and actually what supermarkets are now doing, and what they're going to have to do even more so in the future, is thinking about their brand values. So what makes them different and how they can combine that with a new sort of sense of customer empathy. So people in challenge times, it's interesting, you go from a very generic essential service message, which really worked, back to what you were doing before. So what is your point of difference? You can't talk about this essential service idea for too much longer. The second scenario is the toilet roll scenario. So we've called this soft, strong, and very, very long for those who remember that famous Andrex commercial of the past. And this is about cupboard loading. So slightly similar to scenario one in the sense that you see a huge peak in demand in the early days of lockdown. So this is people buying lots of toilet paper, lots of canned goods, toiletries, and making sure that their cupboards were full so that they could outlast lockdown. But what happens in this scenario is demand falls away more sharply, and actually it's below normal levels, because essentially what you've done is you've moved the toilet roll from the stockroom to your cupboard, and there's only so much toilet roll that you need, right? So it's going to take a while for these sorts of products to sort of go back to the original levels of demands, back to the normal levels. So how can you combat that? So the marketing challenge here really is the need for saliency, to make sure that you remain important. So there are three things that advertising can do to help here, three things that marketing can do to help. So generate usage, make sure that you're maintaining loyalty when there's been a lot of forced substitution, which is, I love this picture here of the lady on the telephone ringing her partner, asking if, you know, the one thing left on the shop shelf will do. So there'll be a lot of people that will have bought brands for a long time who have been forced to try another brand for the first time. So look, how can you maintain that loyalty? And then of course, looking to culture, so make sure that you are relevant. So The first one, generating usage. And this is one of the things I think that people forget about advertising, which is it is very, very good at generating demand for a product, but it's also actually very, very good at generating usage once you've bought that product. And there's a very, very famous campaign that Marmite launched, I think it was in 2013, where they reminded people about Marmite, the product, and the fact that Marmite often gets pushed to the back of the shelf and forgotten about. So if you are one of these brands that fall into this scenario, indifference is the enemy. You want to remind people that you exist, and you want to remind people to use you. You can also demonstrate your product's versatility. So another great way to generate usage. And brands like Weetabix are fantastic at this, which is, instead of having 2 Weetabix, have 3, have it as a snack as well as a breakfast. So can you find clever ways to demonstrate your product's versatility so that you find your product is used at different times? And then finally, can you make your product a ritual? And this is an example from Unilever and their Axe brand, which is Lynx here in the UK. They were very, very clever. And if you think back to these famous adverts of creating a ritual around the use of Axe, which is you spray it under both arms, but you also spray it across your chest. Now, you don't need to spray deodorant across your chest. It doesn't work like that. But again, it's a very subtle way to make people use the product more. So again, very, very clever. And all of these tactics we think are very much pertinent right now to help generate usage. The other thing that you want to do is maintain loyalty. So as I said, when shelves were empty, lots of people were forced to use a different product for the first time. And the thing that you really don't want to happen is people to use a cheaper product for the first time and then kind of think it's good enough and not come back to you when your product is back on the shelf. So ways that you can mitigate against this is establish your position, remind people why you're important. So Lurpak is a really, really good example of a brand that went out there and basically established themselves as the product leader. Great food deserves Lurpak. So again, advertising can help remind people that you are, the number one brand, or that you have a specific product strength. Building on that is loss aversion. And again, it's a very, very powerful piece of psychology, behavioral economics here, which is, can you imagine life without? And Cravendale Milk did this very, very well, which is, could you imagine life without your particular brand? Not the product, but the brand itself. So loss aversion, we think, could be really interesting. And then finally, KFC are doing this brilliantly at the moment. They ran a fantastic social media campaign, which is asserting your brand authority, your product sort of authority. And what they did is they were commenting on people's attempts to recreate Kentucky Fried Chicken at home, and in a tongue-in-cheek way with a bit of humor, basically pointing out that people's homemade KFC was no way as good as the original. So we love that campaign, and it was very, very clever, very reactive, but it just does so much to assert that particular brand's sort of authority and its leadership. Finally, I think it's really important, particularly for this scenario, but across the board, to look to culture. So there's an example here from Co-op, which is continue to do versus say. So there were certain brands that did very, very well out of demonstrating what they were doing to help the wider community during lockdown. Now, actually, we think that's a tactic that you can carry forward. So do versus saying, I think, is important. And then the example here from Apple is be aware of the cultural narrative. So as we move from the new normal to this over the rainbow phase, as lockdown lifts, we think that advertising sort of tropes and traditions are going to emerge. And what you want to do is be able to pull on those without becoming stereotypes. So Apple was very, very good at pointing out its role in an imaginative way during lockdown. So it was talking about creativity. So be aware of the sort of wider cultural narrative and how you can pull on it whilst maintaining your brand's point of difference. Now, scenario 3 is called bouncing back, and there's a Guinness reference here. So good things come to those who can wait. And now I think this is probably not not the most controversial, but this was for those brands who found that their consumer demand had been completely squeezed almost away to nothing in certain circumstances during the height of the epidemic. Excuse me. And actually, what we've predicted is that demand will bounce back for these categories. And actually, what's been very positive is we've been seeing this happen right now. So you think of high street stores, so fashion high street stores, for example, cinemas, which is happening right now. The automotive sector is another one. So dealerships were closed for a very long time. And then finally travel. And I think travel is probably the most controversial, simply because its timings are different to the rest of the scenarios that rest of the categories that fall into this scenario. So the challenge here is, how do you make sure that people remember your brand when they can't buy it? And that's a brilliant marketing challenge. So 3 solutions here. One of which is priming desire for when lockdown lifts, making sure that you're relevant and trying to get ahead of the competition. So could you go early? Could you call the bottom? Excuse me. So priming desire is all about, we call it the prisoner's list, which is on social media. We were seeing during lockdown, excuse me, lots of people talking about what they would do when lockdown was lifted. Excuse me. But actually, what you want to do is, it's not just about, for example, we've used the beauty category here, but also beer is a really good example, which is, it's not I want my first beer, it's I want my first Foster's, I want my first Boddington. So how can you tap into this demand that exists, but put your brand right in the middle of it? For some categories, and I think high street fashion is a really good one, is remind consumers of your brand's role and create newly relevant occasions if needed. So fashion is really interesting because we get most of our cues from, street style, walking around, seeing what people are wearing, personal recommendations, and of course fashion shows themselves. All of that has disappeared during the coronavirus, during lockdown. So actually, if you were a high street fashion brand, think about the new occasions. So what are you going to wear on your first big night out, that first shopping trip? What happens when we go back to work? And brands like ASOS have been doing this brilliantly. I mean, there's a case study to be written about ASOS's social media campaign, getting people ready for the lifting of lockdown. And finally, and I think this is probably a little bit less relevant now, but I think still applies to travel, which is braver, better funded brands may be able to advertise early and take advantage of market conditions. So for those of you who aren't sort of in the marketing world, we have seen incredibly low prices across the board for all media. So not just TV, but also digital, radio, outdoor. Our prices have halved essentially. So there's a lot of value in the marketplace right now. And actually, what we think is happening right now is that when consumer demand returns, when lockdown is lifted, consumer demand bounces back. And so all of these brands are now rushing back into the television market, definitely, but I'm sure it's the same of lots of other media, to start spending again. So people are spending again to basically tap into this demand. But actually, what some brands have done, some of the braver brands, maybe the better funded brands, is they've gone early and they've tried to call the bottom. So they are taking advantage of these lower prices and they are advertising early to prime that demand. Now, the timing depends on the length of your consumer purchase journey. So, for example, if you're in the automotive sector, which has a very long purchase journey, people will spend 2 to 3 months sometimes thinking about their purchase because it's a high value investment. go early. Like, our advice to automotive brands was to keep spending, because demand was going to bounce back, and so position themselves in front of their competitors, and some brands did do that. This is our fourth scenario, and I don't know if people remember. Again, I feel almost nostalgic for this, but Be There, Be Together, Be You is house parties end line. It's its marketing line. And this scenario is all about those brands who did very, very well during lockdown. So these tend to be digital brands, so video conferencing, for example, but also home gyms and that sort of thing. So you have certain brands which became more and more relevant as lockdown was imposed, but as we lift lockdown, demand falls back to pre-crisis levels very, very quickly. And we have some advice here for how those brands can mitigate against that. So how can they take advantage of the demand that they've seen, that, record-breaking demand for most of these brands, and actually keep that momentum going? So be a champion for the category, establish a point of difference, and then invest in the long term. So this is a really interesting one, and we've used the example of video conferencing because it just felt so apt, but I think it does apply for other brands, particularly digital brands in this space, which is market leaders. So they sort of hero brands in a particular category champion the wider category, not just themselves. So I think video conferencing is really interesting. We have all taken part in the biggest sort of social experiment in video calling there's ever been. And we now know the particular product differences of Zoom versus Google Hangouts versus Teams versus House Party. And I personally think there is a real opportunity for one of the video conferencing brands to now champion the category, champion the product benefits. So instead of selling sort of product sort of differentiation, sell the category. The idea that now Zoom could start talking about the benefits of working from home and how freeing that is and what it lets you do, I think would be really interesting for Zoom. It would establish them as sort of category leaders. They would be very, very different from trying to point out that, they have better resolution than Teams and all those sorts of things. So that's quite an interesting approach. The other thing to talk about, and again, this is a sort of fairly traditional marketing tool, but as new markets emerge, and lockdown genuinely has created new markets, new categories that have become mass, is how do you position yourself? How do you create brand differentiation? And archetyping is a good way of doing this. So, what archetyping does is it basically assigns roles to your brand, sort of particular characters. And again, we've used web conferencing here, but you can see very quickly how different brands map into different brand characters. So Google Hangouts is very everyman. Zoom feels like the rebel. Microsoft Teams, very much the ruler. Microsoft are what they are, right? So it's quite an interesting, very simple way to map your brand in comparison to its competitors. And then finally, and this is a bit of a play, as you can imagine, for TV advertising and potentially more traditional advertising, which is these brands that have done very, very well, which have established a bit of a foothold in the national consciousness, is to start investing in the long term. So we know that brand advertising in particular takes a little bit longer, but long term, it delivers much better results. And for those who are not aware of it, there's some fantastic work in this field by Burnett and Field for the IPA. So sort of retail offer-led advertising is great, but it won't necessarily build your brand over the long term. Also, TV advertising provides access to new audiences. So if you are a digital brand in a fast emerging category and you're really, really concerned about growth or market share, TV can help with that. It gives you a much bigger mass audience more quickly. And then finally, think about the recession that is coming. So we know that brands who continue to maintain their level of spend, not even increase it during a recession, will do better on the other side. So investing in your brand now when times are hard really pays back in the future. And again, there's some fantastic work on this across a range of different sources. But again, the IPA is a really good place to start. Finally, we've got a bit of a bonus scenario. And again, another famous thinker here. So this is Plato. So he was a wise man who invented beer. And it turns out the men and women who market alcohol are also very, very wise people, because what's going to happen for beer? Well, you're going to see a demand curve with two peaks. So beer has been one of those lucky categories, and alcohol more broadly, that has benefited during the initial lockdown phase. So we've obviously gone out and bought lots of toilet roll, but we've also made sure that we've stocked up on our favorite drinks too. So that's been, lockdown has been brilliant for alcohol brands, because people have needed to use alcohol to get them through the tough times. But also, and we saw it this weekend, very much so, Super Saturday, which is there is a second spike in demand as lockdown eases. So as alternative distribution opens up, so essentially pubs and bars. So alcohol is one of these lucky categories that sees a double spike in demand. And there are three factors that allow this for alcohol. We use beer here as an example, and Guinness in particular. So as lockdown lifts, other forms of distribution open up. Alcohol, because of the role it plays, has been able to maintain desire during lockdown. So, I love this little meme here, keep calm and love Guinness. But actually, what is so interesting about alcohol is its importance actually increases as lockdown is lifted. So its saliency increases. So we like this idea of, good things come to those who wait. So that first beer, properly poured, sitting on a bar, lots of people were looking forward to that. So alcohol is a really, really interesting scenario here. And, it poses the question, how can other categories mirror this? So there are certain other categories, other brands that will benefit from multiple distribution points. So confectionery is another really good example, which is when we're all back in our offices, we'll be able to buy Kit Kats and things like that on impulse. So, we'll be buying Kit Kats not from the supermarket, we'll be buying them from corner shops and sandwich shops and things like that. You also need to maintain your desire through lockdown. And it's really interesting the way that high street fast food has responded here. So you'll remember that, restaurants like McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King didn't open their restaurants in the early phases of lockdown. And actually what they've now done is they've allowed online delivery to basically maintain desire, remind people that they're still relevant. And, the Mac is back. People got very excited once people could go to McDonald's again through online delivery. And then finally, think about your role post-lockdown. So how can you increase your saliency? So again, I think supermarkets are a really good example here. So if you're Tesco, think about the way that people are going to be behaving. So is it barbecues? Is it house parties? Different types of product for a new time. So think about the way that you can make sure your brand, your business is as important as it was during lockdown. Finally, I think it's worth reminding all brands and all businesses of the wider context. It's very, very easy when you talk to clients to see that they become absolutely focused in on their business and their category without remembering what is going on in the wider world. And this slide is really interesting. If you remember that it was originally sort of created back in April, there are certain things that have happened and there are certain things that haven't happened yet. So once the crisis is over, and I don't think the crisis is over yet, the context does change though. And actually the media environment has been altered by COVID-19, but it's going to change again once lockdown passes. So this is a slightly technical one, but it's worth remembering that lockdown is easing during the summer. And that means that you're going to have lower audiences for TV and digital channels. So during the height of lockdown, we at ITV were getting record audiences. So for every single part of our schedule, we were getting more viewers than we've ever had before. And advertisers who were brave and continued to spend could benefit from that. So those record audiences are passing, and that's very much happening. The other thing which we stressed to all of our clients was that as brands pulled their media budgets, as they deferred their media budgets to later in the year, it was creating a sort of bottleneck of spend. And again, we're starting to see this happen, and we think that it will accelerate in Q3, but particularly in Q4 around Christmas, is as that money comes back into TV and market, the sort of media channels more broadly. I'm sure digital is exactly the same. There's going to be a race to spend, and you are going to find it harder to get the value for money that you have now later on. So we were reminding clients that, okay, it is brave, but actually if you spent today, you would get more for your money than tomorrow. And then finally, this idea of a cultural explosion. And this is the one where I think we are still seeing whether this is going to happen or not, which is there are lots of cultural events which were put on hold. So if you think about football, you think about all the summer blockbusters that weren't coming out over the summer, but lots and lots of different things were put on hold. And actually, we at ITV, it turned out mistakenly, thought that lockdown would have a more sort of definitive end. We thought that, there would be a point in time where we would all rush back to the office and it would only be 12 weeks. Actually, the sort of slow unwinding of lockdown has slightly put a spanner in the works here. But I do think this is going to be true of Q3 and especially Q4, which is there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. So as lockdown lifts, there's going to be more and more to do. And this is absolutely true of the ITV schedule, for example. We've had to postpone a lot of our biggest shows to later in the year because we simply can't make them. We are not allowed to film stuff at the moment. So it's quite interesting. If you're a brand who wants to make a bit of a dent on culture, now is a better time to do it than later in the year because it's going to get very, very busy. It's very easy to forget, if you're a brand and an advertiser, that people are normally more interested in the football than your CSR proposition, for example. So it's worth bearing in mind that as lockdown lifts, as things go back to normal, people will get interested in culture again. There'll be more to do. There'll be more to see. So we stress that to people, which I thought was quite important. So finally, our conclusion. And again, I'm going to point out that, look, I love this quote here, but everything that you've seen here is a model. And as George Box said, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this isn't designed as a super accurate prediction. We know that a lot of these scenarios are panning out as we plan. But as I've said, for example, that cultural explosion point, stuff is still very much up in the air. But we hope that the 5 models that I've shared today will be food for thought. They were designed to be provocative and to get people thinking, and to get people thinking in a more nuanced way about lockdown and what might happen. We found that there was a lot of very big, broad, general statements being made. And we were like, well, hang on a minute. Actually, when you look at consumer demand, different scenarios will happen and different categories will benefit in different ways. So we wanted people to think in a slightly more intelligent, slightly more nuanced way, which hopefully this presentation has helped you do. I mean, again, it's difficult to make a prediction, and now is even more unpredictable than ever. And it's interesting, this list of 6 things here, which back in April were warnings, some of these have definitely happened. So the slow unwinding of social distancing, I think, is the biggest one. So if you think of those consumer demand curves, the slow unwinding of social distancing is elongating them and compressing them. The staggered return to work for different industries, again, really, really important. point three, are we going to have a second phase? So we've already seen local lockdowns in Leicester, for example. If things get bad again, do we have to go back to lockdown? And that will obviously have a huge impact on consumer demand. Hopefully 4 and 5 are avoidable, but who knows? So, high death toll and high unemployment will have a massive impact on consumer confidence, as will high bankruptcies for companies themselves. So, as a media owner, we definitely know that there are some categories, some brands who will not be able to advertise because right now they're just struggling to survive and they're trying to conserve cash. So, we need to be very mindful of that when we as media owners are talking about the marketing world, because there are certain brands who right now it's all about survival, not necessarily growing their market share. But saying all that, I still think it's very, very important to plan for the future. There are some very good articles being written in sort of publications like the Harvard Business Review, lots of those sorts of places, which are pointing out that it's really important to plan for the future. And I think scenario planning is really, really helpful in that regard, which is it's very easy to focus on the here and now. We're finding that some of our clients' marketing teams are really down to a skeleton staff. Furloughing is in full effect, and actually people are understandably very focused on the here and now. But actually, you also need to plan for that next window in time. So, what does happen when lockdown fully lifts? Are there ways that you can steal market share? How do you as an FMCG brand tackle that enforced substitution? So people using own brand products for the first time when they've been with you for many, many years. How can you prime for demand? I think that's still so important. People are sort of emerging into the sunlight for the first time. People are very excited about that first beer, that first trip to the restaurant, that first film they're going to watch at the cinema. How do you make sure it's your brand there? So look, 6 very simple things there. I'm going to stop now because I know that I've come to the end of my time, but I really hope that some of the ideas in this presentation have been thought-provoking. It's very much a presentation full of lots of ideas. We wanted to sort of throw lots of things at people and really get them to think about what might happen as lockdown lifts and get people to think in a more nuanced, potentially more intelligent way, and to think that, the world wasn't going to end thanks to lockdown. Things were going to get back to normal. And actually, it's really interesting right now is some of these scenarios we're very much seeing play out. So I'm going to stop, and I'm very interested to sort of hear people's questions. But if we don't get time to get round to you, this is my email address. I'd be very, very happy to help talk to you if you've got any specific questions about some of the categories or scenarios that we've talked about. We have at ITV more granular reports on some of the categories mentioned, so automotive, travel, for example, grocery, which again, I'd be very happy to share with you. So I'm going to stop now, and I think Lara is going to ask some of your questions.
Thanks, Will. That was really, really good. We have received a question here for you. What were the biggest marketing mistakes you saw during COVID?
So I think and it's completely understandable. And after speaking to the clients who are making these decisions, you appreciated where they were coming from, but the knee-jerk reaction of some categories with those very, very long purchase journeys, those purchase cycles. So automotive is a really good example where predictions were that lockdown was going to last sort of 12 to 15 weeks, which is shorter than the purchase journey of a normal car. Some of those brands, big automotive brands in particular, pulled all of their spend immediately. And it was so frustrating because you were like, look, the marketing theory says that you need to be out in market all the time, making sure that you're top of mind. And because of the sort of collapse in the price of advertising across the board, not just for TV, you could have massively increased your share of voice, which we know is a good proxy for market share. So there's a genuine correlation between an increase in share and voice and then a later increase in your market share. So there were some brands who could have, those sort of challenger brands in those sorts of categories who could have done really, really well and grown their share of voice very dramatically in a very disruptive market. And they just didn't have the confidence to do it. And, they're big multinationals with budget that they could have spent and they didn't. So those were, I think, the biggest mistakes, I think, where certain categories and certain challenger brands could have really made a big impact whilst, we were all locked inside watching lots of television. They could have really made, moves into share of voice, which in normal circumstances could have taken a decade or more. So that was frustrating. But again, I understood, when you spoke to these brand managers, it was a time when people were panicked, and they had to make these sort of decisions. So I think would be the biggest mistake that I can think of.
Cool. There's other questions coming through. Another one is, should brands mention the COVID environment in their advertising, or should they avoid it? It's
a really interesting question, actually. And I'm going to give that classic answer and say it depends. I think that it is a judgment call that you have to make on a case-by-case basis. So taking the example of supermarkets, and as I touched upon, that work that we did with System 1, which showed that when supermarkets spoke about the early days of lockdown, the panic buying, and all of the work that they were doing to basically help get through that crisis, it really resonated. It really, really resonated. And that advertising was some of the most powerful advertising they'd seen this year. So in those sorts of circumstances, I think, yes. I think you have to be a little bit careful not to be seen as profiteering from the crisis. And again, I think that depends a bit on the category and the brand. And actually, again, what System 1 told us is that some brands simply ran some of their old favorite advertising, and actually simply being out there and advertising was actually quite reassuring to people. People liked seeing this television advertising. It sort of reminded them of better times, and the effectiveness scores of that advertising actually went up. So old advertising got more effective because people were just welcoming of that advertising. It felt reassuring in a weird sort of way. So I don't think that you always need to mention the coronavirus. I simply think that, having strong advertising that works and using that, it is more than enough. So it's a tricky one. I think it's very category specific, but I actually think that being present in a time of crisis, and I still think we're in a time of crisis, is enough without having to frame your category in terms of the coronavirus.
Thank you, Will. I'm gonna combine these. There are two questions that are more about B2B as opposed to B2C. So for example, the first question is, you have mostly mentioned scenarios for B2C brands. Do you think there are any specificities that would apply to B2B companies? And then another, Elodie actually asked a question around, again, when you are a B2B company, how can you reach the new audience?
Both are actually quite difficult questions, especially for someone with a background at ITV, because we are very much consumer facing. That tends to be the sort of advertising that does very, very well on TV. So it's a difficult one for me to answer because I don't really know. But I would say that I think there is a benefit again of being present, letting letting your customers know, or your potential customers know, that, you know, you are still able to support, you know, that your service is maybe more relevant than ever. I think that some of those examples that we pulled out about video conferencing, actually, I think are interesting for the B2B world, because I do think that, you know, there was a benefit in letting sort of procurement people and, you know, senior business people know that your product was there, and actually it had a role to play during lockdown as we were all working remotely. But actually, I think that for certain B2B brands that potentially now going out and acting like category leaders might be really, really interesting. So lots of you know, the tools that the tech world are very familiar with. So I'm thinking like some of the project management tools and things like that that they've been using for a long time are going to be super relevant for the future, as more and more of us sort of adapt to at least partly working from home. So I think that there are lessons in this presentation for the B2B world. I think that's scenario 4, I think, is actually probably quite an interesting one, but it's unfortunately, it's not my area of expertise. And it's ITV has always slightly struggled to sort of demonstrate its worth for B2B clients, because we're obviously a mass medium.
Thanks, Will. So we're almost at 2 o'clock, so I appreciate some people might have to drop off, and unfortunately myself as well, got clients commitments. But there are quite a few questions that have come through, and I think Will has got a bit more time to answer all of those. So I'll ask for the alumni relations team to step in and take over. But Will, thank you so much. We really appreciated your time, and we've got really good feedback already from the chat of the usefulness of the presentation, and thank you so much.
No, absolute pleasure to be invited. And I'm always amazed that people will give up an hour of their time to listen to me rabbit on about this stuff.
Great, then have a good day, and we'll chat soon. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Laura. Right, so I've got a few more questions, if that's okay, that we'll just run through, or we've got time. Someone has said, has the concept of the prime time day part changed for ITV?
During lockdown, not really. I tell you that I'm going to sort of slightly flip that question on its head. So prime time is still very, very important to ITV. The programs that we have been running in that prime time slot have changed slightly. So fans of Coronation Street and Emmerdale may have noticed that we went from 5 episodes per week to 3. Some of our huge Saturday night entertainment shows, which are shot in front of a live audience, have had to be reimagined or cancelled. But prime time is still, you know, a big deal for us. So peak is really important. And what's been interesting is that our peak time viewership has remained steady. It's increased by a few percentage points, but actually where we have seen a complete almost reimagining of our schedules is in breakfast and early daytime. So where we have done unbelievably well in terms of our viewership figures are the sort of Good Morning Britain and This Morning. And basically lots of people are working from home or have been furloughed and are watching TV either in the background, or it has become a new part of people's routine. So we have increased our audiences by double digits for that sort of daytime morning schedule. It's been really, really interesting. And I think that because those shows were still being viewed, still being filmed live, you know, the content was very relevant. You know, they weren't pre-recorded. It wasn't a repeat. They felt contextually very, very relevant. So peak time is still important and will always be that. Those primetime slots are, you know, where we have our most viewers, and they always have been. But honestly, daytime has gone completely, the viewership figures have really increased. So it's been interesting that working from home has meant lots of people have been watching television in the earlier part of the day.
Fair enough. So it's just a comment to say this was great. I'll be listening to it again to help someone starting up their small ethical brand at the moment to see what could apply. So that's a little thank you there. And then somebody else that says thank you very much. They work for a property developer in London, and during lockdown they saw no viewings at all because they couldn't see properties in person. And then we saw clients starting to request virtual reality links to explore their homes. And they say virtual reality is very popular. And do you think there's going to be any other new technologies that will help this kind of industry?
This is where I can swap hats here actually, and I'm going to put my Google hat on for a little bit, which is there are sort of terms which are used quite interchangeably. So virtual reality, augmented reality get confused a little bit, and actually one of the technologies that I think would be perfect for this sort of scenario is something called 360 video. So it's essentially the sort of poor man's virtual reality. So it's not as interactive. It doesn't have the sort of depth of experience, but what it will let you do is it will let you sort of pan around a particular space, and it's very cheap to do. It's not quite at the stage where it can be done with a mobile phone yet, but you can use something akin to a GoPro to do it. And I'm when I worked on Google Arts and Culture, we would do a lot of this 360 video to bring to life museums and cathedrals and things like that, and it was incredibly cheap. So when you find yourselves, in an industry like property where you really want to give people an impression of the space, I think 360 video is absolutely the way to do it, and it is much cheaper than trying to build a sort of full augmented or virtual reality world, because that takes sort of some serious technology and proper professionals, whereas actually a 360 video can be done by someone with very little experience. So it's used quite a lot in Google, and people refer to it as virtual reality, but actually 360 video I think would be perfect for the property world, where people might be doing that initial search, they've seen something, they're interested in it, but they can't visit for whatever reason. 360 video is a brilliant way to bring to life a space.
Brilliant. I hope that answers your question. And a question here from Vivian. I don't know if you know the answer. It's quite niche. How was the luxury jewelry industry affected, and where's the trend going?
So luxury is a really interesting one, and we have some conflicting signals. So what tends to happen in traditional recessions, so 2008 is a really good example, which is the very top of the sort of luxury market bounces back relatively quickly. So 2008 was interesting because it was a financial crisis, and obviously the banking world are big consumers of luxury goods. But if you were a sort of Dior or a Louis Vuitton at that very top end, those very high ticket items, demand comes back and kind of does okay. So if you are sort of very high end luxury, like jewelry is a really good example, I think that you will be okay. And again, I think maybe it's more about channels. So, can you buy online? Can you view online, as opposed to actually going to a department store and purchasing there? However, one of the things that we found quite interesting in China is the luxury market has bounced back less strongly than, say, automotive. So it's been quite interesting in China that when you look at parts of China that have been very affected by lockdown, consumer confidence in terms of luxury products hasn't come back as strongly. Now, maybe that will change, but I would say that if your jewelry company is very high end, you're talking sort of pieces which are worth thousands of pounds, I think that you will be okay, and I think that demand will stay relatively strong, but that's a really difficult one because we don't have a luxury wasn't included in the presentation for a reason, because we've had slightly mixed messages on that.
Brilliant. And 2 questions left I've got. Thank you for sharing. It's very insightful. Given that consumers are moving away from time in front of the television as lockdown eases, how can brands continue to leverage on ITV to reach their customers?
So I think this is something that we at ITV, as you can imagine, talk about a lot. And one of the things that we want to ensure, which is once lockdown well and truly lifts, and I think it will sort of be Q3, so sort of September onwards, we want to ensure that our schedule bounces back as strongly as possible. So if ITV was one of those scenarios, we're the Guinness scenario, we're the bouncing back scenario. So the price of our airtime has gone down. And actually what we are hoping is that as demand comes back, our price will increase. But to justify those, we really need a strong schedule. So fans of ITV will know that the European Football Championships, which was big for us, has been cancelled. Love Island, that favourite guilty pleasure, has also been pushed back. Our big primetime sort of Saturday night entertainment shows, again, have all been delayed. So what we want to do is to ensure that brands continue to work with us and that we give brands that reach that they absolutely need TV for. We call it simultaneous reach. So it's this ability to reach lots of people at the same time in a live environment, which is very difficult to replicate in the digital space. We need to provide programming that does that consistently. And yes, it has been difficult to make TV shows during lockdown, but one of the decisions that's been made is that also certain programming has been held back. So we've got some new dramas, for example, which we're going to launch, but actually what we've decided is that we will keep those for Q3 and Q4. So exactly that is, we are able to help brands reach their consumers and do that role that ITV has always done, which is be, the big populist sort of channel which reaches lots of people. So it's all about programming. It really is. Like, the stronger our programming, the better we're able to deliver for our brands that we work with.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And our last question is from Joanne. And she says, are there any changes in consumer behaviour that you think will become permanent post-lockdown?
Oh, an interesting question. So again, maybe it's my age, maybe I'm a bit long in the tooth, but I really believe in the power of the status quo. So again, talking about behavioural economics, we know that the status quo is this incredible psychological pull. And we need to remember that lockdown imposed upon people, behaviours that, were sort of not chosen. So I think certain things like working from home and remote working will be a thing. I genuinely believe that, we'll do a lot more video conferencing, we'll do a lot more working from home if we choose to. But at the same time, people like working in offices, actually, believe it or not. If you work in a creative industry, simply being around people is really important. Same with universities. So there's lots of very, very good studies about proximity, and simply being on the same floor and being able to talk to people over the water cooler is a really, really powerful way to drive innovation. So I do think that there are certain things which people will gravitate towards. I also think that online delivery was a trend that was accelerating for practically all all consumer brands. It's a big deal. And I think that lockdown is going to let more people, for supermarkets, do online delivery. I think that is a real trend. But do I think that maybe some of the things that the press have talked about, sort of greater community spirit, some of the things that we have celebrated in that sense, I hope so. But also I think that, people want things to go back to normal. And some of the things that we've seen in lockdown, I think they will jettison very, very quickly. And I think that the things that do stay, like remote working, like online delivery, will be important. But I think, it's the fourth scenario, I think, that we showed, which is the things that lockdown has made us do will drop away if they're not important, if they're not useful. Like if we're forced to do video conferencing, we give it up as soon as we can. If it's useful and helpful, then we keep doing it. And I think that's the sort of the prism that I would apply to that.
Yeah. Well, that is all of our questions. We have kept everybody for quite a long time. And so, yeah, thank you so much. It's been really, I'm just sharing my final slide. I want to thank you so much for talking to us today and sharing your presentation and your thoughts. And if you have any extra questions, we can share Will's email after the event. And we are recording this as well, so we hopefully can share it to anybody that couldn't make it or you want to watch it again. So thank you so much, and I will end the webinar now, and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And
thank you.
Again, very flattered to be asked. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.